Everyone, I just wanted to say that we're going to be with you just in a second. We appreciate your patience and sorry for the delay. We will still be ending the webinar right at 3 o'clock, so not to take more of your time. Thanks very much. Okay, I think we're in luck. Thanks for your patience. Jason is joining us now, and while he turns on his audio button, we will get going. I see Jason. I thought I saw Jason. He's coming on. There we are. Success.
Oh, great.
Even folks at TED have technical issues. We're thrilled that you're all here today, and we're going to get right into it since we've lost a few minutes, but we'll promise to catch them up. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Ruth Milligan. I am the TEDx Columbus, Ohio organizer. I am working on my second event for the fall. And in our fourth series of the Learning Series for TEDx, which we're Julianne Worm, my co-host from TEDx, and I are leapfrogging each other. This is my turn. I'm happy to have Jason Wishnow with us today. Jason, can you say hello?
Hello, everyone.
Great. Jason is the director of film and video for TED, and he's going to get right into how you're going to shoot and edit your TEDx videos. So let's go ahead and get to it.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ruth. And everyone, thanks for joining us today for this little talk. So I'm supposed to speak today about how to shoot your TEDx events. And I'm in the TED office right now, and I can actually see the whole TEDx team on the other side of the room listening in on this. I'm not going to talk about how to shoot your TEDx events. I'm actually going to change the subject radically, and I'm going to tell you about how to shoot TED. And the reason for that is because a lot of the approach that we bring to shooting the main TED conference is really holds true to how you would also do TEDx as well. So, you know, the way we would shoot for an audience of 1,500 people or an audience of 15 people is really similar. And a lot of the times when you know, people watch TED Talks, they kind of sort of look at a lot of the icing on the cake. But I'm going to get to some of the core things at the heart of the TED conference. My background is I'm the director of film and video for TED. I've been working with TED for the past 4 years, and I was part of the core team that launched TED Talks in 2006. It was Chris Anderson, Gene Cohen, and myself. And my background is as a filmmaker, and so a lot of the approach that I've brought to TED Talks comes from that background and trying to create as cinematic experience as possible. So this is the main stage in Long Beach. Some of you may have seen it. A number of you may not have actually been in the Long Beach Auditorium. And when you watch TED online, you know, one thing that people have commented to me about is, you know, the elaborate stage design and the fact that we shoot everything in HD, and the fact that we have cameras on cranes kind of moving around everywhere. And that's not the important stuff for shooting your TEDx event. The most important thing to keep in mind is what you really want to do is give your online audience, remember the sensation that he or she is sitting in the best, he or she is sitting in the best seat in the house. What we do is we try and create a really incredible experience just overall for the people who come to TED. But, you know, you've got 1,000 people in the room who are really, you know, getting, you know, this incredible experience by being in the audience. And then you could have hundreds of thousands of people watching a talk online. You could have millions of people watching one of those talks later. And we want those online viewers to have as rich an experience as the viewer who is actually in the room next to that TED speaker. And so that's why we have these very high production values at TED. But on the flip side of that, when you're watching online on the web or watching on your iPhone or iPod, you're looking at these talks in a really small window that's, you know, maybe just like the size of a fist or the size of a postage stamp. And so one thing we want to do is really encourage everyone to think about recording these talks so that they'll be viewed in that window. Like, I regard that as a key generative constraint that we have to work with and we have to embrace. And so it's this combination of capturing incredibly high-quality footage and knowing that it's going to be watched in this very lo-fi way that's like a key component to TED Talks. And that said, now is the time for our first survey.
So what we'd like you to do is to look at your screens, and we're going to ask one question. I'm going to launch the poll, and we just would like to know how many of you have actually shot a TED Talk before. And it looks like We have 40% of you have responded. 64% looks like 70% Jason. Still haven't, 76%, 79% voted. We're almost up to 100%. So Jason, it looks like more than around three-quarters of the audience have not yet shot their talk. So
terrific. There's still time. Okay. Well,
the next slide. Hold on.
That's great to know. So I'm going to just break down an outline of what I'm going to talk about over the next half hour or so. And so I'm going to talk with all of you about cameras and how we frame all of the shots for TED. I'm going to talk with you about our stage design, our lighting, and those are sort of the core components of just how we capture a TED Talk. I'm also going to talk about sort of special, unusual situations that could come up. And then I'm going to cover my favorite part of this, which is a list of examples of things not to do when you're shooting a TEDx event. And finally, I'm going to cover some additional prep and some post-production information, all of which is very useful. I mean, and at the beginning of the talk, I will, at the beginning of each section, I'll probably cover like the most important key points, but then I'll flesh everything out for you in greater detail. So that's our list of 8 subjects, which reminds me of number 1. I want to point out to everyone that webinar is not actually a word. And I mean, if you look at like the etymology of it, web is like a place. It's like the World Wide Web, and seminar refers to a place where ideas are exchanged, and the nar suffix is like the place. So anyway, so webinar is like a place, and it sounds like kind of corporate newspeak. And I feel like TED is so much on the cutting edge of everything we do that we need to come up with a better alternative to webinar. So I'm just pointing that out there. Right now I'm going to call this my seminar on the web. And I'll jump to section 2 for you, which is cameras. And so one thing that I always like to say is when we shoot TED, it's not like we're filming a high school stage play with a single camera at the back of the room. When you capture, when I think back to all of the best teachers I've ever had, or the best lectures I've ever heard, they really affect you on both an intellectual as well as an emotional level. And that's something to keep in mind. So it's not like this kind of locked off, kind of bland camera thing. I mean, what we're really doing here is we're making a TED Talk. And that's just a world of difference. And the most important thing to keep in mind for capturing that TED Talk is that all of the speakers who come to TED in their respective fields are rock stars of those worlds. And we try to capture them like that. Like we try to capture the dynamism of what they have to say. When they come to the stage, they're selected both for the incredible work they've done and the incredibly persuasive way they have to articulate their ideas. And so, we want to really capture that. And I mean, when you hear of a taped academic lecture, the first thing you might think of is, oh, this is boring. Oh, we just need, a camera not doing much. It'll be a guy behind a podium. And, all of you are familiar with TED, and you know that it's not just that. It can be so much more. And that's one of the key things that, we've really brought out to the world with TED Talks. So among the most important things to think about is that the camera should always be on. And when I say that, what I mean is throughout your TEDx session or throughout any of the sessions at TED, we start rolling the cameras at the beginning. We stop them at the end of the 2-hour session. We don't pause between speakers. And that will come in handy later for editing, but I just kind of want to point that out. But I don't mean on in that simple kind of on-off way. I mean the camera operators who are running the cameras need to actually the camera operators need to actually think of the cameras as constantly being the live camera. So if they're going to do a camera move or a push in or a pull out, that should be as delicate and graceful as possible and complement the speed and the tempo at which the speaker is talking. And that's very important, to have the camera operator complement what the speaker is saying. Another thing, and this is also really key, especially for the small screen, is that tight close-ups have the most impact. And when you're watching a movie in the theater or when you're watching a movie on your iPhone or on the web, it's that type of really kind of close shot of a person speaking to you becomes a very intimate experience. And that's partly how we sort of hide in the emotion. That's how we hide in the fact that, what they're saying is very important. And they wind up sort of reaching through the barrier of the computer screen to the viewer on the other side. Like when you're in the room where someone's speaking and it's really passionate, and you get that lump in your throat or it's that aha moment, a big part of it is, because you're focusing in on that speaker and really connecting with them. And through editing, we guide the viewer online to have a similar experience. Of course, aside from these close-ups, you want to complement them with considerably wider shots. And those kind of balance things out. Also, they're great for editing. You've got something to cut away to. Having a couple other angles are really helpful. This image up here is from a talk by John Doerr about the environment and about global warming. One thing that I particularly like about it is how clear his slides are that are up on the screen behind him. So, anyone at the back of the room or even on a small computer screen can read that slide. And of course, that comes to a question that I get hit with all the time, which is, why do we cut away to slides when you're watching TED Talks? So when you're at TED, we often have simulcast rooms, and those of you who have been to TED Active know this as well, and some TEDx experiences also have simulcast areas where we'll have two parallel feeds of the presenter and the slides going side by side. And when you're kind of in that live experience, you can shift your focus from one to another, and it's a really organic process. When we're posting talks online and we're editing talks for TED.com, the slides are actually incredibly useful tools for us because we don't just, one thing I want to quickly say as an aside is, when I talk about editing TED Talks, we don't chop them up and create sound bites and turn them all upside down on themselves. But what we do is we try and really tighten the speech. So if a speaker kind of stumbles over his or her words, like I was doing at the beginning of this talk, we might cut out some of the ums and ahs, or we might cut out some of the sentences that start and stop. And, if a speaker accidentally spills water on his shirt, picks his nose and pulls up his pants within a 20-second window, we might cut some of that stuff out. That actually happened to a TED speaker a few years ago, and I won't say who it was, but we hid all of that with a slide. So the slides are really useful when we're editing. And that's why we cut back and forth. And also additionally, we can really time the moment when we cut away to the slide from the speaker and back and forth. It's very easy to be distracted when you're watching a video online, and this is just one more kind of trick up our sleeves to sort of guide the viewer. Of course, you don't always need to cut away to a slide to read it, and here the shot of Al Gore is incredibly powerful, and for certain presenters, such as Al Gore, such as the shot you saw earlier of John Doerr, the slides really can speak for themselves, and in some ways it's even more powerful to see the person standing before the slide. So the great thing about TED is, we've got a lot of cameras that we use to shoot the main stage with, and that's not always something you're going to have at a TEDx event. But when you have that, when you have the sheer quantity of cameras to allow for multiple close-ups, in case the speaker is pacing and turns away from the camera, you can cut to another angle and they're looking right at you in that camera, or you cut to this kind of wide shot where it's more dramatic and you've got this powerful image behind you. It really creates a better picture of what's going on. Of course, there are some angles that are not useful at all, like really acute angles and profiles of TED speakers don't always cut well with the two sort of key shots that I was showing you before. And one thing you really want to keep in mind is that these shots, if you look at them right now, are actually kind of beautiful. And your camera team will love getting shots like those. And in the room, when everything is happening, this is a great camera position, and it looks awesome in the viewfinder. But as soon as you try and connect it with this like tight shot of someone's face or this wide shot, the angle is so drastically different that it just kind of feels like a bit of a hiccup in the edit. So you've also got to think about the big picture when you're framing the shot. The flip side of that, though, is there are certain unexpected angles that might work really well, too. Like here's Hans Rosling at TED 2009, and we had a camera on stage behind him kind of shooting over his shoulder into the audience. But he's a really dynamic and versatile speaker, and he'll often turn around and run up to the screen. And you can see that when he turns around and runs to the screen, we then have that great shot of him looking right at us, right into the camera. And we've got that stronger connection with Hans. Which brings me to the audience in general. Every audience is unique at the different TED events that we have, whether it's at our main conference in Long Beach or our global conferences or a TEDx event. And one thing that is really encouraged is that you get some footage of the audience. And you can do this with a dedicated camera on the audience. You can do this with a camera person who's shooting a variety of audience shots. You can do this with a camera that's mainly on the speaker but occasionally turns away to just get a glimpse of the audience now and then when it's necessary. But it's kind of nice to show the audience at some point in the presentation. And the reason I say that is because now that TED has expanded so dramatically, now that we have TEDx events where you might have 15 people in the room or you might have 1,500, it's great to get a sense of just like who's the speaker talking to, and how's everyone responding to that. Also, sometimes the speakers are so dynamic that you get a standing ovation. It's rare when you think about it to have an 18-minute kind of academic lecturer get a standing ovation anywhere but TED, and it happens all the time. And so it's really dynamic and exciting to see that at the end of a TED Talk. Likewise, if there's a lot of applause or laughter in the middle of a talk, it's kind of fun for that. Here this audience looks acutely interested in what's going on. With those past audience shots that I showed you, those were all done with a camera operator, working with the camera, panning along the audience, and all of that. This shot here is actually shot with a really inexpensive consumer camera that was just attached to the wall at the back of the room. You can see a lot of cameras in here. This image is taken from Craig Venter's press conference from a couple days ago, where he announced that he and his team of scientists had just created synthetic life. And we went down to capture that as a TED Talk, which went live on the site on Friday the 21st of May this year. But we only have very limited resources, and this is the whole press box at the back of the room. And we had 2 cameras shooting Craig, and then we had 1 locked-off camera here shooting the audience. And it actually turned out to be a great shot. So there are a lot of kind of simple things that you can do, again, to capture the big picture of what needs to be done. I want to take you on a little tour through TEDs of the past. This is a shot of Nicholas Negroponte speaking in 1984 at the very first TED. You can see on the slide behind him that he's got a child using an Apple II computer. He was giving a talk about bringing computers to children in the developing world. This is in the mid-'80s, and obviously now he's running the OLPC project. So it's a project that's been going on for a while. But if you look at it, this was shot on VHS. It's impossible to make out the picture. He's this tiny kind of speck in the frame. It's blurry and and kind of difficult to really follow what's going on. Our next shot for you is from 2005, which is right before I got involved in TED, and it's James Watson, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, speaking, and it's not the most flattering shot of this guy. And the thing about it is, he's full of really, rich and interesting stories, and for someone like him, I think, a tight close-up would be incredibly useful, or a much wider shot where if he was kind of rubbing his head, pondering what to say next, as he's doing here at the top of his talk, it might look a little bit more dramatic in the larger setting, or, it keeps us from having sort of an unflattering view of him. And that takes us to how we shoot TED Talks now. And this is Bill Gates at TED 2009, actually, so it's over a year ago. And you can see just the variety of angles we've been employing, where we've got a couple tight close-ups on him so we can really track what he's saying. We've got this reverse shot, which turned out to be incredibly useful when Bill Gates released mosquitoes into the TED audience, and it was the only camera that caught him doing that, because it turned out he didn't tell anyone on the TED team that he was going to release mosquitoes into the room. And this wide shot that contextualizes it. And also in the lower right corner, you can see his PowerPoint slide, which we were cutting back and forth between. And so you can see just the evolution of how TED has been shot, so that we've got these more dramatic angles that really enhance the story of what's being said. And it's all about capturing the essence of what the speaker has to say. It's not just about making the speaker kind of look good or sound interesting. It's about really cutting to the heart of their message and presenting that in as lucidly and dynamic a way as possible. One thing to keep in mind is that the camera is also an audience member. And so when you're originally setting up your venue for your TEDx event, be sure to place the camera before the audience arrives, and be willing to possibly sacrifice a couple seats in the audience to get the shots that you need. Don't take 10 seats out of the audience, don't take 20 seats out of the audience, but be willing to lose a couple seats so that you can have this. And that's really important. The next slide I want to show you here is actually the diagram that we used for shooting Craig Venter's recent speech that I just mentioned. And you can see it's actually a 4-camera shoot. We've got 2 cameras on Craig at his podium, and they're both at the back of the room. And if you look at them, they're both kind of coming out in sort of a V formation from the podium, which the podium is at the top of the screen. The 2 cameras are towards the bottom of the screen, and you can see their angles pointing towards that podium. And so one of them was a wide shot and one of them was a tight shot, and those were the 2 main angles we were cutting between. And then we added a 3rd camera because we knew there'd be a really robust Q&A after he announced that, he essentially created a unique DNA strand on a computer and created synthetic life. So we wanted to have a camera always equipped to capture audience reactions and to capture the Q&A. And then finally, just for a little bit of extra coverage in the room, we had a tiny locked-off camera at the back, camera 4. That was the one that got that audience angle that I showed you a few moments ago. So that's all of that kind of winds down camera placement for the room. And one final note before we leave cameras is the most important thing to remember, though, is people notice bad audio before they notice bad video. You want to have a good set of microphones in the room with each speaker. You may notice at TED we use those Britney Spears, Madonna headset microphones. Those are called Countryman microphones. And the reason we use those is because if the speaker turns his head to the left or to the right, the tip of the microphone will follow their head with them. And if you don't have access to one of those, you can also use a lavalier microphone, the kind that attaches to a shirt, which if the speaker turns his head, you might lose the signal a little bit or get a little bit of a ruffle sound, or you could use a handheld microphone like the one pictured here. There are a lot of options based on the scope of your TEDx event that you can employ, but audio is a lot cheaper than video, so definitely, I encourage all of you to be sure you have the best quality audio when you're capturing your TEDx presenters. And this brings us to another poll.
So thanks, Jason. This has been really informative. I've personally learned a lot. And I think what we're going to do now is move from the cameras to the stage, right? And the poll is a basic question about, have you ever given thought beyond choosing your venue as to what your stage looks like? And so far, most of you have, which is good. Some of you have not. As we have everyone taking the poll, we appreciate your participation. Looks like it's the reverse of the first poll. We have 70% in, so a few more, and we'll close it out. So as we close this out and see that at least 2/3 have thought about it, the question then becomes, at least in my mind, what should we be thinking about our stage? And Jason, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. And
great.
Moving on to, we have 74% said that they have thought about it. So
fantastic.
Move on to the stage.
Okay, well, I think that's really great that all of you have thought about the TED stage. It's one of those things that a lot of people have commented to us about in the past, is just, the TED stage tends to be kind of this interesting venue. And one thing that we've brought to TED over the past few years is a heightened sense of theatricality for, with which to engulf these speakers in. So here's an image of Jay Walker from TED 2008 showing off an Enigma machine and some of the other interesting props that we had on the stage, which was kind of based on the idea of an explorer's library. And so here's a case where, we had a really elaborate stage that was evocative of inquisitiveness, and we've brought elements of this to other TED sets in subsequent conferences. But on a similar note, you don't always need to have something that elaborate. You can simply use lighting or cloth or depth to add some element of additional texture to the stage. I think suggesting that there is depth and texture behind the speaker is very important. You don't really want the speaker to sort of be floating in a void, and it's these little touches that make the speaker stand out are incredibly useful, in the big picture sense of enjoying the talk online. Obviously, they're incredibly useful and important when you're in the room at a TEDx event. So, we're definitely going to.
Sorry.
sorry, I was just handed a note. We're definitely going to the question. So going back to stage and lighting for one more moment, you want to think about just making the room look as beautiful as possible and how that will appear both for the people in attendance as well as for the people online. As far as lighting goes, it's all about adding drama. And I've used the word cinema before to describe how we shoot TED Talks with these tight close-ups and, again, with this dramatic lighting and elaborate sets. And, it really does add something to the TED experience. So before we move on, I would like to go back to topic number 1, which is, unless we have a better name, I mean, even cyber conference is more of a word than webinar. Really, like anyone, if you want to submit alternate names for webinar, feel free to email me or Ruth or Julianne, and we'll come up with something. And
I believe there's a TED Talk in there somewhere.
There might be.
New term for webinar.
But more important than that is back to shooting TED. So everything I've covered with you is all about capturing the essence of a great talk when you just have a standard speaker on the TED stage. But there are a number of other types of presentations that happen at TED, like tech demos. One piece of advice I want to give is always rehearse those, because with a tech demo, things go wrong. Remember how it took me like 8 minutes to log in for this seminar on the web? Things like that invariably will happen. So you want to make sure it runs smoothly, but you also want to make sure you capture like the details. And this is the type of thing where you might want to take a camera off a tripod and get a tight close-up of some like really interesting prop or piece of equipment that the speaker has brought in. Another thing that comes up is music. And I've said before, we treat our speakers like rock stars. This is actually where you can afford to shoot them like rock stars as well, and with an even heightened sense of drama that may not work for a lot of speakers. Believe me, I mean, this like type of incredible lighting could work for some speakers, but the more cameras, the better. When you're shooting music, the better footage you'll achieve. So a couple things to think about are that you want to have a tight close-up on a singer if you've got a vocalist, and if you've got your performer with a full band, then you'd also want a wide shot to contextualize the singer with the rest of the band, and then you'd want to have a shot that's a close-up of the different instruments, and then you'd want to have a camera that's doing close-ups on the backup vocalist. And, I could go on and on. If you think about it and the sheer number of instruments you might have with performance, it's easy to, it's really, really easy to have a lot of cameras on stage, and that's not always possible. But even with a few cameras, you can kind of rotate around between those different types of things. But definitely you want to make sure you catch those key things that you need. And that also feeds into how to shoot interviews. Every once in a while at TED or TEDx, there will be an interview. And there's a really standard interview camera arrangement that I'd like to just point out to you, which involves only 3 cameras. It's one camera on the person being interviewed, say Bill Gates, another camera on the interviewer, Chris Anderson, and a third camera that just contextualizes the two of them and shows them side by side. The thing you want to keep in mind is, like, with the Bill Gates shot, you don't also want to show Chris, and with the Chris shot, you don't want to show Bill. And that's for editing later. Like if, Bill kind of stumbles over a couple words in the middle of an answer and kind of wants to start over, and we want to, cut that out so that the story he brings to the conversation is as clear and clean as possible. You can always cut away to Chris nodding in agreement. This is a device that we've all seen while watching the news over the years. And that's what this framing will give us. Here's the same framing again, Chris and Gordon Brown. And the reason I want to show this type of shot again is to emphasize the fact that each camera really has to trust that the other camera has got its shot. And so, if Gordon Brown were to suddenly, pull out a Rubik's Cube, the camera that's on Chris should still stay on Chris. And knowing that the camera on Gordon Brown, would capture just that. And so that's really important to do, is talk with the camera people in advance, encourage them to be on the same page with each other. When you've got a live event and you have a director who's calling the cameras, who's got a feed of all the cameras to a bank of monitors, and who's got headsets on and can talk with the camera operators, you've got an extra foolproof technique to ensure that you have that type of uniformity between cameras. Again, it's really easy for a camera operator to see something interesting and just go for it. They know they might be getting an interesting shot within their lens, but what they don't know is how it's all going to get together. And that's where the director comes in, and that's the footage the editor will see later. And so what I also want to talk about before I move on to the next section is the TEDx logo. The TEDx logo is a very important part of your TEDx experience and your TEDx environment. So, and then after that, I'll hit on, common mistakes. But if you look at TED Talks online, you'll often see a TED logo beneath the screen or to the side of the screen in large foam, possibly with a light on it, possibly even illuminated. It's important to have the TEDx logo somewhere in frame, near the screen like that. And when you are filming the TEDx logo, generally you'll have it in one of your cameras. You don't always have to worry about, ensuring that, you're not clipping the TEDx logo and you're only seeing like the TEDx New York logo or something. But at least for the wide shot, you will wind up having the full logo. And if the speaker is pacing and kind of moving back and forth in front of the logo, it adds kind of an interesting visual texture behind the speaker. But you definitely want to have it in there to contextualize the fact that your event is a TED-affiliated event, and all the hard work that went into it, is credited. So now that I've gone through cameras and lighting and staging and logos, I now want to talk about common mistakes that can come up. Here are a few things to avoid. Number one, awkward frame compositions. Like, this is a shot from a recent TEDx, and this is the type of thing that really we should try to avoid. Shoot the speaker, not the screen. One thing we do is capture and collect the slides that the speakers have, and so we can cut those in later. It's that tight close-up of the speaker looking at you and kind of connecting with you that is so important to TED, or the wider shot that just frames them on the stage and gives a sense of what the image is behind them. And this kind of doesn't do either. This is actually, regrettably, a very common thing for someone behind a camera to do. So you need to remind them not to do that, and you need to tell your director to tell them not to do that. You'll be surprised how often this type of shot happens, especially at other conferences. I have got a few other things to avoid. This is the flip side. This is awkward screen cropping. Here is Lawrence Lessig speaking, and his entire slide here is like one really simple sentence. It's 3 words. And if the camera was just a little bit wider here, we could read those 3 words. Like this, we'd actually have to cut away to the slide. And honestly, I'd rather look at Lawrence Lessig and pick up what he's got to say here. So this is another thing to be wary of. And another thing to be aware of is not obstructing the camera or bumping the camera. Like I said before, you want to be mindful of where you place the camera, And if you're like right in the middle of, an unusual room for your TEDx event, which, often they can be in homes or restaurants or auditoriums, or seminar rooms, or outdoors. There's a lot of variety there. It's easy to have people sitting next to the cameras, and it's easy to have someone bump the cameras. And so you want to avoid that. And then also, you want to keep that speaker in focus. Like if you look at this shot, you've got, dark shadows coming down from the lanterns that are decorating the room, and the speaker is actually completely blown out. The camera operator could have made a couple adjustments so that the speaker would have more detail on him rather than the guy in the striped shirt and the guy in the polka dot shirt and the bald guy having the most detail on them. And so, you don't really want to block the speaker. You could, in situations like this, you may want to raise the camera a little higher so you can have like a little bit of a raked audience, in the shot. And this is this has the potential to be a good shot, but there are a couple little things that could make it a very good shot, and it needs to do those. So I'm not just going to talk about TEDx shots. I'm going to show you some material from actual TED conferences. And here's something. Here are two different cameras on opposite sides of the room, and this footage was shot simultaneously, and it's the identical shot composition. You've got to keep the edit in mind. If the speaker is saying something and we need to make a cut to, remove an or an or, something else that happens that might be a little awkward, then cutting from two shots that look this similar would be a jump cut. And what you want to do actually is have a bit more variety. So that's why cutting from a wide shot to a close shot feels a little bit more smooth and elegant. And it's really easy for the director who's calling the cameras and to get caught up in the minutia of one camera and not another, and overlook the fact that you've got a bunch of cameras framed exactly the same way. So that's something to be wary of. Another thing to be mindful of is shots that appear flat. And this is from TED Active at TED 2010 this year. And this is actually a really fantastic talk. And the camera could have been moved a little bit over to the right and placed at a little bit of an angle so that you could look over the speaker's heads at the speaker, much like that shot I showed you a couple slides back with the lanterns. And that would have had a sense of dynamism. It would have kind of moved towards you in the z-axis. And the way this looks, you've got like half an audience and then sand. And so it's kind of an uncomfortable viewing experience. And this isn't really a shot that you can cut to all that much. So go for dynamic angles. Also, going back to lighting, you want to avoid backgrounds that are too dark. It's easy to think, oh, a black background will look really dramatic, and as long as we've got a great spotlight on the speaker, that'll work. The thing about TED speakers is they all wear black. Seriously, like I can't tell you how many speakers come to the TED stage wearing black and then disappear into the background. So that's one reason why we have a lot of texture in the background, to avoid stuff like that. The flip side is backgrounds that are too close, where you might have like a strong cast shadow from the in the next slide, I'm going to show you a speaker who's like right up against a wall, where you can see the shadow right up against that, and you can see all these awkward shadows on the wall. If there was a TED logo kind of taped up against it, it would also sort of create this sort of awkwardness. And of course, there are backgrounds that may look great in the room, but they don't capture well on camera. Here's Craig Venter in front of his step and repeat, and here's Dean Ornish in front of this kind of olive-colored wall, which in the room was a totally different shade of yellow that looked gorgeous. One thing to be aware of is the camera will sometimes pick up lighting in a totally different way than it appears when you're, when you're in the room. And so there have been TEDs where in the room it might look like the lighting on the wall was blue, and then online it might have looked kind of purplish. And that just has to deal with how cameras pick up color. And so when you're setting up all the lighting and setting up your stage, you want to frame everything within the cameras and make sure that it will all look good on the camera as well. Here's another thing to avoid, which is uncomfortable looking speakers and unbalanced shot compositions. This kind of unbalanced shot goes back to that one I showed you in the desert, where you have the speaker and an audience on one side and then this kind of empty void. And also here the speaker looks just a little bit uncomfortable, and that leads us to the additional preparation section, where I'm sure you've all heard about how when speakers come to the main TED stage, we present them with the TED commandments, where we give them guidance on how to carry themselves on the TED stage. We also do something unusual for a conference, which is we rehearse with the speakers. And one thing that I always like to do is pull the speakers aside right before they give their talk and encourage them to just feel as comfortable and confident as they can when they're up on stage. That's the most important thing. As long as they're exuding some kind of confidence, they'll do great on stage. As long as they know what they're saying, and sometimes it can be a little intimidating to take the TED stage. So that's something we always do, is encourage them to be comfortable on stage, and it's probably one of the most important things you can say to a speaker. This goes back to me being a director, and it's not just about the camera, but it's also about working with the talents and having the talent be at their best. Another thing that fits with that is you'll also want to remind the speakers to provide clear and succinct visuals. Presenters at TED tend to have better and better slides each year, but it's really easy to have someone come to you with a slide that's just covered with text, where you can't really see what's going on, and it's just kind of a jumbled mess. And when you're looking at the talk online and we shrink down a slide that's covered in text, it's really difficult to read. And when you're in the room, it's really difficult to read as well. So the key is to remind speakers to just have a few keywords or key images that can really stand out, and to go with those. And that brings us to our third poll.
And in the interest of time, we're going to skip over it and keep going.
Okay, I'll just tell you how we were leading you to this next image, which was the third poll was going to be do you think it's important for speakers to have slides? And my response is some of the best speakers at TED have never brought slides. And that is, of course, Ken Robinson. And now I'm going to dive into the last section, which is post-production. And so the next section I'm going to go over, which I'll just go through rather quickly, is something that you really want to share with your technical team. Some of you who are not very video savvy might not be familiar with some of what I'm going to cover, but it's not a lot of jargon. So the first thing is, ideally you want to shoot progressive scan for the web. This is a close-up of Hans Rosling from 2006. You can see these zipper-like lines through his hands. That's an interlaced image where older television sets used to draw every other line of a frame and alternately between frames. And when you hear things like 480p or 1080p or 720p, that refers to a progressive image where the camera captures a full frame, much like a photograph, at once, and you don't get this kind of zebra pattern that you have to remove in post-production, and so you wind up with a much higher quality image. So that's something I always encourage people to do. The next thing is, regardless of whether you're shooting NTSC or PAL or HD, you want to capture each camera to its own tape if you're planning to edit later. The thing about the web is it doesn't matter, where you are in the world, if you're NTSC or PAL. It doesn't matter if you're SD or HD, if you're standard definition or high definition, because the web is this egalitarian medium where, frame rates will get stripped down to kind of a uniform number, and resolutions will be reduced to a uniform image size. But one thing we always do, which I said before, is we wind up re-editing each talk. And to do that, we like to work with all of the original camera angles so that we can go back to frame 1 and find the best possible edit. So that's like a little trick we do. But you don't have to record it to tape. Lately, at our main conference at TED, we've actually been shooting direct to hard drives. And this is an image of something called a Key Pro by a company called AJA. And I've been using these and have had success with them both for recording standard definition media and high definition media. And what they do is they will take a video feed straight from your camera and record to a little hard drive that you can then plug into a computer and edit off of that. And the nice thing about the Key Pro is it captures in the codec that we use when we're editing. So again, this is for your tech people. If you digitize the footage yourself and then want to send us the footage, we need to get it in the Apple ProRes 422 codec. This is a QuickTime format that's incredibly high resolution. It yields great quality for high definition video and phenomenal quality for standard definition video. So I want to just remind you, ProRes 422 is our codec of choice. In fact, it's the only option, really. It's all we're taking now. The other thing is we don't just record all of the cameras to their own videotapes or their own hard drives. We also record a direct feed of the PowerPoint presentations or whatever slides or images or video clips the presenters bring to the main stage. And by doing that, we can work that footage in to our edit and have it completely sync up so that all of the transitions happen exactly where the speaker made them happen when the speaker was on stage. And also be sure to get the original PowerPoint files or Keynote files or JPEGs or whatever. Get those files because those are incredibly useful because those are much higher resolution generally than the video that's captured to tape, and we'll often try and cut some of that material in directly. And that's the full rundown on how we shoot TED, and a lot of which is applicable to shooting TEDx. So in a kind of quick summary, it's all about capturing just a couple tight angles on the speakers with a little bit of variety, getting all of those, gathering all of the original assets and PowerPoint slides so you can edit them in, and adding a little bit of cinema to your production. So I want to thank all of you, and if any of you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now as well as by email afterwards. My email address is jason@ted.com.
Jason, in the interest of time, I've pulled a few quick questions from our audience. Thanks, everyone, for sticking with us. And we understand if you need to jump off, but we'll go ahead and ask just a few questions to tie this up. The first is, what's the number of cameras that you would consider to be optimal to shoot a TEDx event?
Just so you know, we've shot TED with anywhere from 3 to 8 cameras. And so I would say at the bare minimum, you'd want to have 3 cameras. one close-up, one wide, and then one reverse angle that you can use to capture the audience. And then that one can also become handheld for a musical performance or a unique demo or something on stage.
Great. And then there was another question just about, for those about the closed captioning and the transcriptions. And if you want to just make a comment about that and how that's working for the group, because it sort of fits in the same technical category.
Right. So I'm not the best person to answer all of the transcription and closed captioning questions, but what winds up happening is after the talk is edited, that's when we make the full transcription and in turn kind of drop it into our pipeline for translation.
Great. Just got to throw that up there.
Yeah.
And certainly there's more people that can help to clarify if there's
additional there questions
are. On that. We're not expecting you to be the master of all knowledge, Ted, by any means. And then I'll just leave it with one more question that's come up, and that is, as you're watching the live streams, which have become obviously a part of almost everyone's TEDx programs, is there any advice that you'd give back on shooting a live stream or things that are sort of, you watch them if you have, hopefully you have, that we should be aware of?
I mean, the live stream is interesting. Everything that I've said really holds true for the live stream as well. The benefit of what I've been talking about is you get the benefit of hindsight, and after the fact you can re-edit the material. You've got all of these individual camera angles that that you can choose between to really choose a cut point at just the right moment. With the live stream, it's great to have an editor with a sense of timing who's also interested in what's being said. And live streams aren't always quite as smooth as a talk that's polished afterwards, but you can have very polished talks. The director who was calling the cameras at the last TED also calls cameras for prints. And I think that was just me taking the, we treat our speakers like rock stars a little seriously.
And I just really want to ask one more question about that, because it came up when we were doing our first TEDx event, which was the concept of having someone calling the show or doing a program record, so that I walked away with 3 camera angles in a program record from the night, as opposed to only walking away with 3 sets of tapes that weren't edited, and I couldn't post on my website almost immediately. And just telling people that that's possible. It's not what you'll use, obviously,
right,
when it comes to editing, if a talk were to make it to TED.com, but that at least for publication on an individual site, you may not advocate that, but it does cut down on time and cost, at least for quick review.
Yeah, honestly, I highly recommend it. I mean, especially for a TEDx event where you don't know what the outcome is necessarily going to be. Your director will be that much more on top of his game if calling the cameras for a live mix as well as all of the ISOs. And that's a great tool for us here at TED to use to look at, so that we can predetermine which TEDx talks we might want to put on TED.com. And if we see something that we really like, then we'll turn around and say, hey, could you send us all of your camera ISOs? We want to edit those in-house and put them up on the site.
And explain to people, just tell people what a camera ISO is versus a program.
The camera ISOs would be the individual isolated camera tapes.
Versus that which someone has done switching on.
Right, versus a mix, which would be, so what generally happens is you've got, say, 3 cameras, and they're all recording to individual isolated tapes, and then they're going through a switcher board, and you've got someone who's saying, okay, let's start with camera 1, the close-up, then let's switch to camera 2, the wide, then we'll go back to camera 1, and that gets recorded to a separate tape of the live mix.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that. Well, we are exactly at an hour. We apologize again for having a slow start, but I think we caught up, and Jason put a ton of time into this presentation, and we want to thank you for sharing your insights and and experience with us today. And hopefully everyone knows that this talk will be available on the TEDx resources page for you to share with the rest of your teams, and especially your technical partners, so that you can get all of these points down as you plan your TEDx event.
I may want to edit out some of the ums and uhs.
We'll be sending out a notification about next month's webinar, so look for that, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. Take care. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks.